The day she placed that baby in my arms, I didn't know I was holding the most expensive lie of my life. The room was warm with candlelight, and the air smelled like sage butter and cinnamon pie. It was Thanksgiving 2019 in Asheville, North Carolina, the kind of night my late wife Mary would have loved. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell us where you sat or listening from. Samantha had set the table like a showroom, gold napkin rings, linen folded into sharp triangles, place cards in looping script. She stood at the head of the table like it already belonged to her, and in a way I think she believed it did. She waited until the last bite of pie was gone, until the old clock over the fireplace struck 8. Then she slid her hand across the table, rested it on Mason's, and circled his knuckle with her thumb in slow, deliberate little loops. She tilted her chin just slightly, like she was preparing for a spotlight. And then she said it, "We store having a baby." The room erupted in applause. Margaret gasped. Mason's eyes filled like a boy seeing snow for the first time. Samantha leaned into him and let the silence hang for a heartbeat too long. The kind of pause that doesn't mean surprise. It means victory. I forced a smile, but my stomach tightened, because this wasn't just news, it was a move. The Hanover Family Trust was drafted in 1996. I know every line by heart. The first grandchild inherits 40%. $6.2 million. Mary and I built that fortune together. Blueprints, contracts, years of sweat, and Samantha. She'd studied it like scripture. She'd been in Claire's office during the prenup months earlier, asking pointed questions she disguised as small talk. That night, I didn't clap. I watched. After everyone left, the house fell into that soft, post-holiday quiet. The dishwasher hummed in the background. The oven timer dinged even though nothing was inside, just an old habit from Mary's late-night baking. I turned off the lights one by one, walking through the rooms like a man pacing through a memory. And then I saw an envelope on the kitchen counter, crumpled, torn at the corner. St. Joseph's Women's Health, Concierge OB Retainer, $2,800. October 14th, 2019. Addressed to S. Keller, not Hanover. Paid in cash. I held that paper beneath the kitchen light. Mary picked out in 2003, the one that made everything look honest whether you wanted it to or not. My thumb pressed over the date. My jaw locked. She hadn't even changed her name on the medical file. I didn't throw the bill away. I folded it carefully, the way I used to fold blueprints when I knew a structure had a flaw hiding in its beams. I slipped it into the second drawer under the cutlery. Mason never opened that drawer. It became my first drawer of truths. Upstairs, Samantha claimed she was tired. Morning sickness, she said. Mason followed her like a man wrapped in a warm fog. The house exhaled around me, but I didn't. The trust clause wasn't written for liars. It was written for legacy. Blood. Mary and I had been meticulous about that. Issue by blood or legal adoption of my son. It was ironclad. Or so I thought. I sat alone at the kitchen island, tracing the numbers on the invoice with the edge of my nail. $2,800. No insurance. Concierge care isn't an accident. It's a plan. Outside, the wind dragged the oak branches across the kitchen window. I walked the hallway barefoot, past the nursery door we never used after Mary died, past the portrait she hung herself. I stopped beneath the clock and listened to the silence pressing in. It wasn't rage yet. Rage is loud. This was quieter. This was a crack in the foundation, the kind only a builder notices, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. At 3 in the morning, I came back downstairs, opened the drawer, read the bill again. October 14th, Keller paid in full. I folded it once more, slower this time. People think betrayal arrives like a storm. Mine arrived like a soft rustle of paper. I didn't tell Mason. I didn't tell Margaret. Architects don't swing hammers at the first fissure. We study the structure. We find the load-bearing walls. We wait. When Samantha said we're having a baby, she wasn't sharing joy. She was marking territory. And I, still grieving, still trying to protect what Mary built, almost let her. I didn't know it that night, but everything that would follow, the DNA tests, the courtroom, the gavel, started right there. With a candlelit smile, with a thumb circling my son Set's hand, with a crumpled $2,800 bill sitting on my kitchen counter. That was the night suspicion took root. Silent, patient, relentless. It's strange how betrayal doesn't always arrive in darkness. Sometimes it wears golden ribbons and glitters under Christmas lights. December 2019 came early that year. Samantha transformed the house into something out of a catalog. Warm white bulbs wrapping the porch rails, wreaths on every door, and an 8-foot Fraser fir in the living room, so perfectly symmetrical, it looked like it had an agent. She'd only been part of this family for 14 months, but she decorated like she owned the place. And the part that unsettled me most, Mason let her. She hung stockings on the mantel. Mason, Adan, and hers embroidered in red thread. The Queen. Not Samantha. Not Keller Hanover. Just the Queen. That's not what you call yourself when you're joining a family. That's what you call yourself when you think you're running one. She walked around the house in that cream cashmere robe I'd bought Mary one Christmas years ago, humming carols under her breath. She even draped one hand on her barely showing stomach like a royal portrait. And Mason, he just followed, soft-eyed and infatuated, the way men do when they mistake control for love. I remember standing at the kitchen island, coffee in hand, watching the lights blink in the reflection of the bay window. It felt less like Christmas and more like a stage being set. Underneath the garland and eggnog, a hairline fracture was widening. She'd insisted on hosting Christmas Eve dinner that year. Family tradition, she called it. But the truth is, she wanted the stage. She loved when people looked at her the way she wanted to be seen. Adored, essential, untouchable. And Mason, God, he tried. He avoided my eyes every time she called the baby the heir. She did that often now. Little slips. Always in a half laugh like she was joking. But she wasn't joking. She'd just say things like, the Hanover heir deserves a proper nursery, or this estate was practically built for a dynasty. And each time she'd glance at me just long enough to let me know she knew exactly what she was saying. I spent most of that evening pretending to enjoy the party. The house smelled like cinnamon and pine, but beneath that there was a coldness that didn't belong to winter. Mason laughed louder than usual, the way someone does when they're drowning quietly. Samantha floated through the room like a woman who'd already secured her place in the family portrait. And me? I was listening more than I was talking. Architects notice tension in structures before anyone else does. After midnight, the guests left. Mason went upstairs to bed. Samantha stayed downstairs a while longer, sipping mulled wine by the tree. She didn't notice me standing in the dark hallway. Or maybe she did, and just didn't care. She took out her phone. I remember the glow lighting up her face, a smile, not warm, not soft, slid across it. She texted someone. Then tucked the phone into her robe, picked up her keys, and stepped quietly toward the side door. 11:48 p.m. The frost on the window made the world look grainy, but I saw her. I saw the way she wrapped her scarf with practiced ease. I saw the gray sedan at the edge of the drive, and I saw her walk straight toward it without hesitation. The driveway camera blinked red as it recorded. I didn't follow. Not that night. You don't chase a crack in the wall, you let it spread until it shows you the shape of the rot. Instead, I went into my study. The same study where Mary used to help me draft blueprints late at night. The same room where the Hanover Family Trust sat in a fireproof drawer, right beneath Mary's old leather-bound notebook. I opened that drawer, took the trust out, and laid it flat on the desk. The page that mattered was already creased from how many times I sat to read it. The first grandchild shall inherit 40% of the total trust corpus. Samantha wasn't carrying a baby. She was carrying a key. And Mason was holding the door wide open. I stared at the trust until my eyes blurred. The numbers had weight. $6.2 million. Real estate, dividend accounts. Mary's architectural royalties. Everything we'd built together. If Samantha had her way, the moment that child was born, she wouldn't just be a mother. She'd be the de facto controller of nearly half of everything. All through guardianship. All through the trust. I thought of Mary then. How careful she'd been about legacy. How she'd written that trust clause like a promise to the future. For our bloodline, she wrote in her own hand in the margins. And I thought of Samantha walking into that gray sedan at 11:48 on Christmas Eve, smiling like she'd already won. I didn't know yet who was behind the wheel, but I knew what it meant. She wasn't where she said she'd be. And if there's one thing I've learned about deception, timing is never a coincidence. Before going to bed, I opened a small notebook I kept in the nightstand. I wrote down the time, 11:48 p.m., then gray sedan, unknown driver, and finally check camera feed. People talk about revenge like it's fire, but mine didn't start with flames. It started with ink. That night I barely slept. In the morning, Samantha greeted me in the kitchen wearing that same cream robe, hair immaculate, smile polished. She poured herself orange juice like nothing had happened. "Sleep well?" she asked. "Like a man with a good security system," I said. She laughed too brightly. And that's when I knew she thought she was smarter than me. The garland, the embroidered queen, the way she called the baby the heir, it wasn't arrogance, it was strategy. The cracks were no longer just cracks. They were spreading through the beams. I spent my entire life studying structures. You don't build something that lasts by looking at what's visible. You build it by understanding what's hidden beneath. By the spring of 2020, I wasn't just a father. I was an architect staring at a house with hairline fractures running through its bones. Samantha thought she'd built her stage perfectly. A pregnancy wrapped in ribbons, a name embroidered on a stocking, a trust clause waiting like a loaded vault. But the thing about vaults is they only open when the key fits. I started digging. The first person I called was Clara Jameson. Clara had been our family attorney for more than 2 decades. She'd helped Mary and me draft the Hanover Family Trust in 1996. She was there when we signed it, when we funded it, when we etched our intentions into its bones. Clara knew the trust better than anyone alive. We sat in her downtown Asheville office on a gray March afternoon. Rain tapped the window like a metronome. Clara pulled the thick folder from her filing cabinet, flipped to the marked page, and underlined the same line I set read 100 times. "Issue by blood or legal adoption of my son." She looked up at me over the rim of her reading glasses. "If that child is incipient Mason sips biologically, she has no claim to the trust. None," she said. "Not a penny." That sentence was the first real beam in my plan. I didn't confront Samantha. I didn't tell Mason either. Architects don't announce when they find rot. They shore up the structure in silence. The second step was physical. I changed the gate code. March 12th, 2020. Samantha never noticed. Mason assumed it was for security. I posted new notice signs at the edge of the property, legally required, small and metallic. But they mattered. Every recorded movement after that point would be admissible. That's the difference between anger and strategy. The third step was quiet surveillance. I hired a licensed PI, a man named Ray Connors I'd used years before when a contractor tried to short Mary's foundation project. He wasn't flashy, he was invisible, perfect. "Start with the edges," I told him, "not the center." He nodded. Good investigators are like good framers. They know where the weak joints are. Meanwhile, Samantha Sip's performance grew louder. Baby announcements were already flooding social media. She Sept begun using the hashtag #HanoverAir under every post. Ultrasound photos. Maternity dresses. A caption that read, "Our legacy starts here." Not Mason's legacy, not our family's. Our legacy. Ours. The fourth step was closer to home. Mason Septa's old MacBook sat in my workshop, the one he used through college before Samantha came along. I asked him casually one afternoon, "Do you mind if I clear this out? I could use it for some old architectural files." "Sure," he said, not even looking up from his phone. He trusted me. Too much. I didn't touch it yet. I cataloged it. Because the worst thing you can do with evidence is use it too soon. Every night that spring, I walked through the house after everyone went to bed, past the walls Mary painted herself, past the room Samantha was already calling the nursery. It wasn't even finished. She'd ordered designer wallpaper before the first paternity test could have even been taken. She acted like destiny was a contract. But destiny doesn't hold up in court. Contracts do. By mid-April, Ray had installed discrete cameras at both the front and side gate. Legally posted, date-stamped, storage encrypted. Nothing dramatic, just the quiet kind of defense Samantha wouldn't notice until it was too late. And Mason? He was still lost in the fantasy. He'd sit on the porch some nights talking about fatherhood, the way his dad, that's me, had built a life with his mom. He wanted to believe love made families unbreakable. He didn't see that love isn't what makes legacies secure. Paperwork does. One night after he went inside, I sat under the porch light with a legal pad in my hand. I wrote out the trust clause by memory. Then beneath it I listed every legal lever I had: guardianship law, DNA chain of custody, trust distribution freeze. I drew lines like I used to draft buildings. I wasn't set angry. I was precise. Samantha strutted through those months like a woman already crowned. She'd booked a high-end baby shower venue for August, $4,300 deposit. Mason thought it was sweet. I saw it for what it was: proof. Because every receipt was a piece of her timeline, one I could use later. In early May, I drove up to Mary's favorite overlook on the Blue Ridge Parkway. It was the first time I'd been there alone since she died. The wind was sharp, and the mountains below looked endless. I held the trust copy in my hands, folded once. I whispered into the cold, "I tell protect it." Mary Sip's handwriting was still there in the margins. For our grandchildren. She wrote that in '96 with blue ink that had faded just slightly. She didn't mean for her legacy to be used as bait. By late May, the house was calm on the surface. Samantha was nesting. Mason was smiling. I was building a legal fortress brick by brick. The cameras were up. The PI was in motion. The trust was locked. Mason's laptop was cataloged. And most importantly, Samantha had no idea. If there's one thing I learned from 30 years of architecture, it's this: the most dangerous structure is the one that looks solid from the outside. Autumn arrived that year like a curtain drawing back on a stage I hadn't built. By October 2020, the leaves in Asheville were burnished gold, the air sharp enough to make every sound echo a little longer. That's when the ghost showed up, not the kind that rattles chains, but the kind that hides in plain sight. Ray, the PI I hired, was good at silence. That's why I trusted him. He never called. He showed up at my door early on a Tuesday morning with a manila folder under his arm and a look that said, "You were right." We sat in my study, the same room where Mary's framed blueprints hung on the walls. He slid the folder across the desk, and I knew before I opened it that something inside would change everything. "Name Seps Ethan Cole," Ray said. "Pharmaceutical rep, married once, divorced, no kids, but he Sep's been around a while." I opened the folder slowly. Inside was a series of time-stamped stills printed on glossy paper, pulled from the surveillance camera at a motel off I-40. The kind of place you don't stumble into accidentally. October 18th, 2020, 7:46 p.m. Samantha walked out of a gray sedan wearing the same cream coat she'd worn at Christmas. She wasn't meeting a friend. She wasn't at a prenatal appointment. She was meeting him. Ethan Cole, late 30s, navy jacket, hands in his pockets like a man who'd been here before. The timestamp in the corner burned into me. 7:46 p.m. It wasn't late enough to hide. It was early enough to be planned. She's been seeing him since before Thanksgiving last year. Ray continued. First sighting, November 7th, 2019. Same car, same motel, same routine. The first sighting was before the pregnancy announcement. Before we sent her having a baby. Before she placed a hand on Mason's and smiled like she'd won. I traced the edge of the glossy print with my thumb. It felt cold. "Any money trail?" I asked. Ray flipped open a second folder. "Not direct, but she paid in cash every time. Concierged OB visits too. No insurance trail." I already knew that part. The $2,800 concierge OB bill from my kitchen drawer had told me everything I needed to know months earlier. Now I had a name, a face, a date. "She sips careful," Ray said. "But not as careful as she thinks." I leaned back in my chair and stared at Mary's old drafting table against the wall. There's a moment in architecture when you realize a structure is beyond cosmetic repair. You stop trying to patch. You start planning demolition. I thanked Ray, handed him his retainer envelope, $3,000 in crisp bills, logged and dated for court use later, and locked the folder in my filing cabinet. From that day forward, every time Samantha smiled in that house, I saw Ethan Cole standing beside her in the shadows. She didn't know it yet, but the shape of her game had revealed itself. And I was no longer guessing. I was documenting. Around that same time, Samantha began calling herself matriarch, not as a joke anymore. She corrected people if they called her anything else. "I'm the Hanover matriarch," she'd say with that polished Instagram smile. It would have sounded laughable if $6.2 million weren't at stake. But I had an advantage she didn't know existed. Clara had quietly frozen discretionary trust distributions in late September. No announcements, no alarms, just legal silence. Nothing could move out of that trust until we determined paternity. And Samantha, too busy taking maternity selfies under strings of fairy lights, didn't notice. Mason, though, Mason was starting to smoke again. Not weed, not anything recreational. Just old Marlboro Golds on the porch after midnight. That's how I knew the cracks were starting to reach him, too. He'd stare into the dark like the man who'd walked into the wrong story and couldn't find the exit. "She's just stressed," he whispered one night when I stepped outside. "Pregnancy, you know?" I didn't tell him what I knew. Not yet, because sometimes you don't save a house by kicking down the door. You wait for the walls to talk. October faded into November. Samantha Sepp's pregnancy updates were now scheduled like press releases, every Thursday at 10 a.m. sharp. Heir on the way. Our legacy in bloom, a dynasty begins. She treated the trust like a crown she was already wearing. Meanwhile, I added one line to my growing evidence ledger each night. October 18th, Ethan Cole, motel. $3,000 retainer paid. Time-stamped surveillance. Legally posted. Witness Ray Connors. Every detail mattered because every detail would end up in front of a judge. I changed the gate code again on November 4th, 2020. This time Mason didn't even ask why. I think he assumed I was being overprotective. In truth, I was tightening the perimeter, legal and emotional. The quiet part of revenge is patience. It doesn't roar, it waits. Thanksgiving 2020 came and went without a big announcement. Samantha hosted again, of course. Wore another cream dress, posed with her belly, and called Mason Daddy in front of my sister. Margaret smiled politely. I watched. I kept seeing that photo of her and Ethan in my mind. 7:46 p.m. October 18th, gray sedan, motel parking lot. Smile like a woman who thought no one was watching. She didn't know that I'd already placed the legal equivalent of rebar around the trust. She didn't know Clara had prepped the paperwork to freeze guardianship claims the second DNA was questioned. She didn't know about the PI, the timestamps, or the folder with Ethan Cole's name printed in bold. Mason didn't either. And that was the hardest part, because in all of this, he wasn't the villain. He was the house she'd chosen to occupy. And I was the man quietly reinforcing the foundation before the storm. By early December, I'd stopped wondering whether Samantha loved my son. I knew the answer. She didn't irk. What she loved was the power of a last name, and she thought that power was untouchable. But the thing about architects like me, we build things to outlast storms. We build them to reveal where the weak beams are. She was the weak beam. By March 2021, the walls of that house held more secrets than I could count. I'd spent a year gathering facts like bricks, stacking them, aligning them, building a fortress one document at a time. But no fortress prepares you for the sound a heart makes when it cracks open. The moment came on a Sunday afternoon. Not a fight, not an argument, just a sound. Mason's breath catching in his chest when the truth finally touched him. It started with a text message, or more accurately, a text thread buried inside his old college laptop. The one I'd cataloged months earlier, left untouched until the day I knew the structure was ready to bear the weight. The baby had been born 3 weeks earlier, February 25th, 2021, a Thursday. 6:03 p.m. Samantha had gone into labor with all the cameras she could gather around her. She'd posted a polished black and white photo of Mason holding the baby in the hospital room like it was a royal announcement. She captioned it, "The Hanover heir has arrived." But in the weeks that followed, something in Mason's eyes had shifted. The glow had thinned. He started walking the property late at night, hands jammed in his jacket pockets, staring at the gate camera like it held answers he didn't want to ask for. That Sunday, he found me in the garage. I was sanding down the frame of Mary's old drafting table, one of the few pieces I'd kept untouched since she died. He leaned against the doorframe like a man already tired. "Dad," he said, his voice small, "do you still have my old laptop?" I didn't ask why. I just handed it to him. I'd kept it powered down, stored in its original case. Evidence works best when it stays clean. He opened it right there on the workbench. It took a minute to boot up, that old fan wheezing like a smoker on a hill. He typed in the password he'd used since high school. His birthday, no hesitation. The messages were still there. The text that broke him wasn't a fight. It wasn't even angry. It was casual, cold, calculated. A thread between Samantha and Ethan Cole dated November 15th, 2019, 10 days before the pregnancy announcement. Samantha: "Once the money sips in, we set her out." Ethan: "You sure he'll never know?" Samantha: "He said'll believe whatever I say. They all do." Mason stared at the screen for what felt like forever. His thumb hovered above the trackpad. Not clicking, not scrolling. His breathing slowed, like he was trying not to drown in something he'd never seen coming. I didn't say a word, because betrayal like that doesn't need commentary. It's loud enough on its own. He clicked open the photo thread attached to the conversation. There they were, Samantha and Ethan, arms around each other at that same motel, time-stamped December 2nd, 2019. Before the Thanksgiving announcement, before the trust would have ever recognized that child. And beneath that, a draft of a guardianship filing template, filled out with Mason's name in the father line. Not filed yet, but prepared. When Mason finally looked up at me, his face wasn't angry. It was pale, hollow. "She planned it," he whispered. "She planned everything." I didn't move. I let him come to the truth on his own. His hands trembled when he clicked into the bank app next. I'd shown him the joint marital account months before, but he'd brushed it off. This time he looked: $180,000 in transfers over 13 months. Designer nursery, maternity photo shoot. Family branding consultant. Yes, she'd actually hired one. The words spilled out of him in broken breaths. I thought she loved me. I placed my hand on the wooden table beside him. Not on his shoulder. Not yet. Because this wasn't the kind of pain you touch away. It was the kind you stand beside. "She didn't love you," I finally said quietly. "She loved the name and the money that came with it." The garage was cold, but Mason's silence was colder. That was the moment the wall cracked. Not between us, but inside him. The next morning, I called Clara. "It's time," I told her. We met at her office on March 8th, 2021. I laid the printed text thread on her mahogany desk, photocopied, dated, annotated. She scanned the lines like a surgeon reading an X-ray. "This is more than enough," she said. "We can file for a court-ordered DNA test. Chain of custody through St. Joseph Seps. You said'll need Mason F6 consent." She looked at him then, not me. Mason sat stiff in the chair, hands clenched in his lap. "She lied to me," he said. Clara nodded. "She lied to all of us." Mason signed the consent form, with shaking hands. I walked out of Clara's office that day with a copy of the petition in a labeled folder. The architect in me had drawn the last line on the blueprint. The structure was clear now, no more guesswork, just the math of truth. The hardest part of revenge isn't the planning. It's the quiet between the steps. The hours after someone you love learns the truth, and the world doesn't stop to comfort them. Mason spent that night on the back porch with a bottle of whiskey he didn't finish. He didn't cry. He didn't rage. He just stared at the trees like a man who'd been hit with a wrecking ball made of paper. I sat inside at the kitchen table, the same place Samantha had once smiled at me over pie, and listened to the steady beep of the gate keypad when I changed the code again at midnight. It was almost ritual now. She still didn't then know. She was at home in that house, sleeping next to him like nothing had changed, but everything had. By the end of that week, the petition was filed, court stamped. Clara's office handled the chain of custody arrangements with St. Joseph's cell. A legal date was set for testing. For the first time in this entire ordeal, Mason stood next to me, not as a boy blinded by love, but as a man ready to face the truth. His shoulders were heavier, but they were squared. She thought the Hanover name would be a key to a vault, but she never expected the vault to push back. There sets as sound silence makes when it sets as loaded. When you've filed papers but haven't yet served them. When you're sitting in the same house with someone who doesn't know the floor beneath them is about to give way. Summer 2021 in Asheville was humid enough to make the air feel like it carried secrets. Samantha was glowing for all the wrong reasons. Mason had stopped smiling for all the right ones. And me, I was waiting for the system I'd built to start doing its work. The DNA petition had been filed in March. Court calendar delays, a backlog of COVID postponements, and Samantha's habit of dodging service stretched the process longer than it should have. But delay isn't always your enemy. Sometimes it's a gift, because silence lets people reveal themselves. She started pushing. Guardianship meetings with attorneys, social media posts branding herself, matriarch of Hanover investment advice for the nursery like she was CFO of a dynasty. She had no idea that Clara had already filed a temporary restraining order on any trust disbursement pending paternity. She was climbing a ladder I'd already sawed off halfway up. She showed up at brunches with her friends wearing linen dresses and diamond bracelets Mason couldn't afford without her carefully curated Hanover name. She'd started wearing the family crest pin. Mary had designed an heirloom I'd let her borrow once for a charity gala. She'd never returned it. That tiny gold pin had become her costume crown. Mason had changed too. He didn't say much, but his silence was different now. It wasn't the quiet of denial. It was the quiet of a man listening to the creak of a roof beam above his head and finally understanding what it means. Every time she talked about the future, he stared at the floor. The first real escalation came in June. Samantha cornered me in the kitchen one morning, wearing silk pajamas and a practiced smile. The baby, my supposed grandchild, was in a pastel bassinet next to her, swaddled like a press release. She held her coffee cup like a prop and said, "I've been looking into guardianship filings, just to formalize things. You know, for the trust. It's Sep's what Mary would Sep wanted." It was the way she said Mary that made something old and buried in me stiffen. She said it like the name belonged to her. I wiped my hands on the towel, looked at her, and said nothing. Silence is heavier than a weapon if you know how to hold it. She kept talking. "It's Sep's just paperwork. It's Sep's not like anything that's in question." I thought about the DNA petition sitting in the court clerk's office downtown. I thought about the chain of custody lab date already confirmed. And I thought about the envelope I would receive, eventually, that would end this entire charade. But I didn't tell her. Because power doesn't come from shouting. It comes from watching someone walk straight into the wall they built themselves. By July, posted a carousel of photos online, her and the baby in front of the house, filtered like a magazine cover. Caption, "Building the Hanover dynasty one brick at a time." She didn't even realize those bricks were mine. Meanwhile, the service team finally reached her attorney. A confirmatory DNA testing date was locked in for late September. I marked it in my ledger the way an architect marks a poor date. September 22nd, 2021, St. Joseph's Medical Center. I wrote it in black ink, permanent. Samantha didn't know. Mason did. He signed the final lab chain of custody forms at Clara's office on a rainy Tuesday. His hands didn't shake this time. His signature was steady. He didn't look like a son anymore. He looked like a man who'd finally taken off blinders. She kept dodging process servers for weeks after that, forcing us to refile notices twice. But here's the thing about legal walls. They don't care about avoidance. They don't bend because someone smiles at a camera. They hold. In those months, the house got quieter. Not peaceful, tight. Samantha filled it with noise. Fake laughter, baby coos recorded on her phone, plans for family holidays. But beneath it all, the air buzzed with what was coming. Every night I walked the halls after she went to bed. I checked the locks, I checked the cameras. The sound of the gate keypad beeping as I changed the code again in August became the metronome of my revenge. She never asked why. She thought she still owned the stage. She didn't even realize the lights were dimming around her. Mason started therapy in August. He didn't tell her. He told me one night, sitting on the porch, he said, I'm not sure what kind of father I am right now. You stir not, I said carefully. Not until the truth comes in writing. He nodded. Didn't argue. That was the moment I knew he wasn't going back. Samantha's online empire grew louder as the walls around her narrowed. She launched a blog called The Air's Nest Interviews. Bragging rights, sponsorships. Every post, every caption, another brick in a house she thought she was building on bedrock. She didn't realize she was standing on sand. She told her friends she was filing guardianship papers in October. She told Mason it was to protect the heir. She didn't realize we'd already filed motions that would make her claims worthless if that DNA envelope said what I knew it would. August bled into September. The air turned crisp. On the morning of the 22nd, Mason and I drove together to St. Joseph's Sack. We didn't talk much. He wore the same navy jacket he'd worn to his high school graduation. Samantha was served the appointment notice an hour before the test. She screamed at him in the driveway. He didn't scream back. The test itself was clinical. Mason swabbed his cheek. The baby swabbed next. The technician sealed the samples in a tamper-proof envelope. Chain of custody signed. I made sure Clara received her copy before we left the parking lot. Samantha tried to act unbothered that night. She made a roast chicken, lit candles, played music, but her hands shook when she poured the wine. She could feel it. The silence was no longer soft. It was a weight pressing down on every polished corner of the house she thought she controlled. She didn't know it yet, but the truth was already locked inside that envelope. The house was never hers. The trust was never hers. And soon not even the illusion would be. Some moments don't announce themselves with noise. They arrive quietly, like the sound of an envelope sliding across a desk, and nothing after them is the same. January 10th, 2022, a Monday. Asheville was brittle cold that morning, the kind of air that makes old wood creak. I remember the way the light came through the kitchen window in a sharp, pale line. Clara had called at 8:43 a.m. It's here, she said simply. She didn't need to explain what it was. I drove to her office without turning on the radio. The roads were clear, but the world felt heavy. I parked in the same spot I'd parked in the day. Mary and I signed the Hanover Family Trust in 1996. That memory felt close enough to touch. Clara met me in her office with the envelope already on her desk. St. Joseph's Medical Center seal. Chain of custody stamp, tamper-proof tape intact. She didn't make me sit. She just placed the envelope in front of me and waited. I ran my thumb over the edge of it like it was a live wire. Adan, she said softly. Whatever steps inside here, we handle it carefully. We do it right. I nodded. I'd spent 2 years building a structure around this moment. Cameras, evidence, bank statements, lawyers, quiet nights, changed locks, frozen trust distributions, Mason's broken heart, Samantha's lies. All of it led to this single thin rectangle of paper. I opened the envelope with steady hands. Inside was a single sheet of paper. St. Joseph's DNA analysis report, case no 22 Nieces 0074. Father, Mason Hanover. Child, redacted for confidentiality. Result, paternity probability, 0.00%. I didn't gasp. I didn't cry. My breath just shifted, like a foundation beam settling after years of strain. The truth wasn't said aloud. It was still. For the first time since Thanksgiving 2019, I felt the structure under me stop moving. No more hairline cracks. No more guesses. Just fact. Clara didn't speak. She didn't need to. She slid me a copy of the report, then carefully sealed the original for court submission. Her movements were precise, rehearsed. She'd been with me through every step. She knew what this moment meant. I pressed my thumb against the margin of the report, where Mary Sepp's handwriting lived in memory, for our grandchildren. She hadn't meant this. She'd meant blood, legacy, the family we built, not the family someone else tried to fake. I looked at Clara. File the declaratory judgment, I said. My voice didn't shake. She nodded, already drafted. We set to submit this afternoon. The rest of that day passed like a film in slow motion. Mason came by after lunch. He knew the envelope was arriving. He didn't ask for a soft landing. He just said, "Tell me straight." I handed him the copy. He stared at it for a long time, jaw clenched, eyes unfocused. "So, it sets not," he whispered. "No," I said. "It sits not." He exhaled through his teeth. A sound too quiet to be a sob, but too deep to be just air. He sat on the edge of the couch, like a man watching the world rearrange itself around him. I would set him, loved him anyway. Mason said finally, "I really would set him." I believed him. That's the thing about my son. He loved with his whole chest, even when the person in front of him didn't deserve it. I sat beside him. "This isn't sets about love," I said. "This is about truth and legacy, and your mother Set's name." He nodded slowly, gripping the report like it was both a lifeline and a blade. That was the moment I saw something in him solidify. Not hate, not rage, but resolve. Meanwhile, Samantha had no idea. She was out running errands that afternoon, probably buying another dress for her public appearances, on that blog she called The Heir's Nest. She still thought the house was hers, the trust was hers, that the baby was her ticket to a fortune she didn't earn. She didn't know that a single piece of paper had just erased everything she'd built. That night, the house was quieter than it had been in years. Samantha prattled on at dinner about some guardianship paperwork she wanted to finalize soon. Mason didn't respond. He didn't even look at her. He just folded his napkin slowly, set it down, and excused himself. I stayed at the table, watching her. She was so sure of herself, so confident. She couldn't see the iceberg under the waterline. After she went upstairs, I unlocked the study and placed the DNA report in the fireproof safe with the original trust agreement. I laid them side by side, the beginning and the end. I stood there for a while, just listening to the hum of the house. The same house Mary and I built beam by beam. I whispered her name, not loud, just enough to feel the weight of it settle in my chest. Samantha thought she'd rewritten the story of our family with a single child. But blood doesn't set lie, and paper doesn't set forget. The next morning, Clara filed the motion for declaratory judgment with Buncombe County Superior Court. I added the filing number to my ledger, one clean line. January 11th, 2022, paternity judgment motion filed. Samantha still didn't know, but the house felt different now. For the first time in years, I wasn't walking on shifting floors. I was standing on bedrock. The silence that followed wasn't tense anymore. It was deliberate, final. March 6th, 2023. The air outside Buncombe County Courthouse was gray and thin, the kind of cold that sneaks through your collar and stays with you. I'd stood in a lot of buildings in my life, but that courthouse had a kind of stillness that felt like judgment before the gavel even dropped. Samantha thought this was her coronation. She showed up in a cream-sheath dress, hair smoothed to perfection, pearl earrings, stroller angled just so for the cameras she'd tipped off herself. She didn't walk through those courthouse doors. She glided. She had no idea she was walking toward the end. Ethan Cole was there too, lingering just outside the courthouse steps in a charcoal coat, pretending to be a nobody. He didn't make eye contact with me, but his presence alone was enough. His name was in the file. His shadow was in the story. Clara met me at the bottom of the courthouse steps. She handed me the file like it was a hammer. "Ready?" she asked. I nodded. I'd been ready since the night I found that $2,800 OB bill in my kitchen drawer. This was the structure I'd built for years. One line, one record, one piece of evidence at a time. We entered the courtroom at 9:01 a.m. Judge Powell presided, A no-nonsense man with silver hair and a voice like he'd heard every kind of lie and grown bored of them all. The court clerk's hands were steady as she arranged the files. Samantha sat across the aisle, her attorney whispering in her ear. She looked composed, but her hands, those elegant, manicured hands, kept twisting her wedding ring in tiny nervous circles. Mason sat beside me. He wore a navy suit that didn't quite fit anymore. Not because it was too big or too small, but because he wasn't the same man who'd bought it. He looked straight ahead. His jaw was set. When the judge called the case, Clara rose. Your Honor, this is a petition for declaratory judgment to determine heirship under the Hanover Family Trust, dated 1996. Issue before the court whether the minor child in question is a lineal descendant of Mason Hanover. Samantha's attorney objected to nothing. He couldn't. The DNA results were certified, chain of custody verified, and entered into the court record. Clara walked the court through it step by step. The trust language, issue by blood or legal adoption. The prenup excluding trust assets entirely. The DNA report, St. Joseph's Medical Center, case note 22-22-0074, paternity probability 0.00%. The timeline. The expenditures. The guardianship filings Samantha had drafted in advance. Every word was deliberate. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Samantha tried to keep her smile intact, but it faltered at the DNA report. Her attorney leaned toward her, whispering something tight. She shook her head once, fast. Her gaze flicked to Mason, maybe for mercy, maybe for control. But Mason didn't look at her. Judge Powell lifted the DNA report. He read it slowly, deliberately, as if each number were a nail in the coffin she'd built for herself. Then his voice filled the room. This court recognizes the Hanover Family Trust clause as unambiguous. The child is not a lineal descendant of Mason Hanover. Declaratory judgment is entered, no beneficiary rights. Samantha inhaled sharply. That was the first honest sound she'd made in years. Clara rose again. Your Honor, we also ask the court to affirm that Mrs. Samantha Keller Hanover has no legal standing to claim any trust distributions under guardianship theory. The judge didn't hesitate, so affirmed. That was it. 2 sentences. Years of lies, calculations, and manipulation folded into 2 simple lines of law. The gavel came down like steel against stone. Samantha's perfectly constructed empire. Every Instagram caption, every brunch brag, every designer nursery wall, collapsed without so much as a creak. The reporters she'd tipped off were already there. You could hear the faint click of camera shutters as she stood up, dazed, still trying to adjust her mask of control. She'd expected headlines that crowned her. Instead, she was walking out of that room with her title stripped clean. I stood, straightened my jacket, and walked past her without stopping, but I looked at her once. Just once. The same woman who had once sat at my Thanksgiving table, swirling her thumb around Mason's hand like she was already measuring the vault. She lowered her eyes. Mason didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He just walked behind me, steady, quiet. That's the thing about truth. It doesn't need to roar to level a room. In the hallway, Clara handed me a copy of the court order. March 6th, 2023. Declaratory judgment. No heirship, no claim. I folded it carefully, like blueprints finally realized. Outside, Samantha stood at the bottom of the courthouse steps. Cameras pointed at her, questions flying like gnats. She tried to smile again, but the edges of it were fraying. Ethan Cole had already started walking toward the parking lot. He didn't wait for her. The wind picked up then, rattling the bare branches of the courthouse trees. The same kind of wind that had blown through my house the night she announced the pregnancy, but this time it didn't chill me. It felt clean. Clara exhaled. That sets that, she said. I nodded. That sets that. We walked down the steps, past Samantha, past the cameras, past the wreckage she didn't think could happen. She had built her castle on a lie, and I'd taken it apart one brick at a time. She thought money made a family. She thought a child could be a key to a vault, but she'd forgotten something simple. You can fake love, but you can't fake blood. When the car doors shut, the silence wasn't loaded anymore. It was finished. Final. The hammer had fallen. 2 days after the gavel came down, the house felt like something new, still standing, but stripped of echoes that didn't belong to us. March 8th, 2023. A Wednesday, morning light slid across the hardwood floors in long, soft lines. For the first time in years, I walked downstairs and didn't feel that pressure beneath my ribs. The foundation was steady again. Samantha was packing. Not slowly, not tenderly, frantic. She'd traded her cream sheath dress for black leggings and a hoodie. The woman who used to glide through my house like it was a movie set now moved like someone trying to disappear between the lines. The gray sedan sat in the driveway with its trunk open. Designer luggage stacked like monuments to every dollar she thought she'd secured. Bags she bought with the $180,000 she'd siphoned from the marital account. She didn't look at me as I passed through the living room, but I looked at her. This was the same room where she'd once draped a hand over Mason's, where she'd smiled like she already owned everything in it. Now she was just noise fading out of the walls. Mason sat on the porch steps, shoulders bowed, elbows on his knees. His hair hung loose over his forehead, and his hands were clasped so tightly they were white. The wind carried the scent of early spring, wet earth, pine, the faintest trace of smoke from the chimney I hadn't lit in weeks. I walked outside and sat next to him. Not close, just enough. "She Sep's leaving," I said. He nodded once. "Yeah, I heard the zipper at 5 in the morning." The silence between us wasn't heavy anymore. It wasn't the silence of something waiting to break. It was the silence of a house exhaling. "She lied to me, Dad." His voice was low, almost steady, but under it was the kind of fatigue that doesn't come from lack of sleep. It comes from carrying someone else's lie too long. "Yes," I said, "she did." He pressed the heels of his hands to his eyes. "I should have known all those little things. The motel. The way she talked about the trust. I should have known." I shook my head. "No. You loved her. That's not a crime." He laughed then, but it wasn't set joy. It was a small, broken sound that made the porch feel too big. She built a future out of something that didn't set exist. And I believed it. The front door slammed. Samantha came out carrying the baby carrier in one hand and a large designer bag slung over her shoulder. She didn't cry. She didn't yell. She didn't even look at Mason. She just opened the trunk, shoved the last of her things inside, and clicked the latch closed. Then for just a moment she turned back. Her face was unreadable. She wasn't the queen she thought she was. She wasn't the matriarch, the influencer, the woman with the golden key to a family fortune. She was just a woman with a plan that had burned out in the cold light of a courtroom. She walked to the driver's seat, slid in, and closed the door. The engine started with a low hum. Mason didn't move, neither did I. When the gray sedan rolled down the driveway and disappeared past the gate, the house didn't feel empty. It felt returned. Mason stayed quiet for a long time. Finally he said, "I don't hate her. I wish I did." I turned my head toward him. "Hate would mean you still owe her something you don't set." He nodded, eyes fixed on the gravel drive like it held the last of something he didn't want back. Inside, the silence settled differently. No tension, no performative cooing in the hallways. No camera flashes, no hashtags. The baby's nursery door was closed. It wasn't our nursery, it never had been. Clara came by later that afternoon with final copies of the declaratory judgment. The trust remained untouched. The court order had stripped Samantha of any claim, financial or otherwise. I signed one last acknowledgement, logged it in my ledger, and closed the binder I'd been keeping since November 2019. "Feels different in here," Clara said, standing in the foyer, looking at the sunlight. "It is," I said. For the first time in a long time, it said it was just ours again. She gave Mason a quiet nod before she left. She didn't have to say anything more. Her job was done. The trust stood. The legacy was intact. That evening, Mason and I sat on the back porch again, this time with mugs of coffee instead of whiskey. He didn't talk much, but he didn't need to. There's a kind of grief that isn't loud. It just reshapes you quietly. "Do you ever stop blaming yourself?" he asked suddenly. "No," I answered honestly. But eventually you learn that loving someone who lied to you doesn't make you stupid. It makes you human. His shoulders slumped, but not in defeat, in release, like someone who'd been carrying a load they didn't realize they could set down. The stars came out early that night. The gate light blinked in its steady rhythm. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to change the code. Samantha had left nothing behind worth keeping. Not the dresses, not the blog, not the staged photos. She had taken the lie she'd built and driven it out of our lives. The house didn't nest echo with her anymore. And in the quiet after the storm, the only thing left standing was the truth. Spring came early that year. By April 2023, the oak trees outside the Hanover house were already heavy with new leaves, and the air carried the faint smell of rain and mud, like the world itself was rinsing the last traces of something bitter away. The house had been quiet for weeks. Not a brittle silence, a clean one, the kind that gives a man room to breathe again. I'd spent the better part of March closing loops. Clara filed the final notice with the court, ensuring the trust ledger reflected what the declaratory judgment had declared. No heirship, no claim, no guardianship. Samantha's name was scrubbed from every page of financial connection. $6.2 million of family legacy stood untouched, just as Mary had intended. Not parceled out to someone who faked her way in. Not diluted through manipulation. Intact. Clean, waiting for the right bloodline. Or none at all. Mason moved into the guest wing temporarily, mostly because being alone in the house he'd shared with Samantha felt too much like living in a ghost's shadow. The nursery door stayed closed. He didn't rush to change it. Grief doesn't need speed, it needs room. One night, in early April, he knocked on my study door and leaned against the frame. He was holding a small, beat-up box with college stuff scrawled on it in black marker. Inside were a few things that survived his years with her. An old notebook, some photos, a keychain from a road trip. Nothing valuable, everything heavy. "I think I'm done pretending she'll come back for any of this," he said. I looked up from my ledger. Good. He dropped the box in the trash bin by the door. That simple sound, the cardboard sliding against plastic, was more final than any gavel. Mason started therapy regularly that month. He didn't talk about it much, but I saw the change in small things, the way he stood a little straighter, the way his eyes met mine without that residual fog of shame. The bruising from betrayal doesn't vanish. It calcifies into understanding. Samantha's online empire withered almost overnight. The heir's nest went dark within a month of the verdict. The sponsorships disappeared when the story did. The photographers stopped showing up when the fortune was no longer hers to parade. Her posts dwindled from staged elegance to silence. Ethan Cole disappeared too. Last I heard through Clara's quiet legal channels, he'd moved 2 counties over and changed jobs. Men like him always vanish when the golden ladder breaks. In late April, Clara came to the house to go over the amended trust document one last time. She sat at the kitchen table, her glasses perched low, flipping through the crisp legal pages. "No heir, no problem," she said dryly. "The principle remains. Income distributions continue to charity per Mary Sepp's instructions. Should Mason have children in the future, provisions apply. Otherwise, the corpus transfers to the foundation in perpetuity." It wasn't a fairy tale. It was architecture. Clean, deliberate, unshakable. I initialed each page, signed where she pointed, dated April 26th, 2023. "This house stands," I said when we were done. "Yes," she replied, tapping the binder shut. "It does." After she left, I walked out to the big oak tree at the far end of the property. The same oak Mary and I had planted a time capsule beneath in 1998. It was the year Mason turned 4. The year she wrote me a note that ended with, "Protect what matters." I knelt down, pressed my palm to the soil, and closed my eyes. The bark above me felt solid, unbroken. Samantha had tried to rewrite our story with smoke and mirrors. But legacies like ours aren't built on appearances. They're built in the dirt, in signatures, in the quiet strength of those who refuse to hand over their foundation. I opened my eyes and looked back at the house. For the first time in years, it didn't feel like a stage set with an imposter in the spotlight. It looked like home again. Mason joined me outside later, hands tucked in the pockets of his jacket. He didn't say anything at first. We just stood under the oak, watching the evening light stretch across the yard. I don't know what's next, he admitted quietly. You're not supposed to, I said. You're supposed to rebuild, brick by brick, on your own terms this time. He nodded, eyes fixed on the house. I sipped I'm not the same person I was when she moved in. That sips the point, I told him. You stir stronger now, the cracks showed you where the weak beams were. The wind moved through the leaves overhead. The same oak that had watched our family build itself, fracture, and now stand again. Inside I'd already changed the locks. Not out of fear anymore, but closure. The old gate code was gone, replaced for the last time. No more surveillance folders stacked against an enemy. No more PI reports sitting in a drawer like loaded ammunition. I'd filed everything away, labeled, indexed, done. In a small, quiet act of peace, I burned the printed photos from the motel surveillance. In the fire pit behind the house, the glossy paper curled and blackened until it was nothing but ash. The evidence had done its job. The structure was secured. The past didn't need to live in drawers anymore. Spring storms rolled in the next day. Rain soaked the driveway, washed the dust off the porch, and filled the gutters with the smell of clean earth. When the thunder broke, it wasn't ominous. It was steady, like the house breathing again. Mary once told me that legacies don't need protection when times are easy. They need guardians when times are brutal. I'd done my job. This wasn't set revenge anymore. It was restoration. I walk through the house alone now. Not empty, just mine again. Every step I take echoes differently. Not sharp, not brittle, steady. It's late April 2023, weeks after the trust was amended and the last legal ribbon tied off. Mason moved into his own apartment downtown, a small place with uneven hardwood floors and too much light. I helped him carry boxes up 3 flights of stairs and watched him set a coffee mug on the windowsill like it was a flag. That's how healing begins, not with declarations but with small, quiet claims on new space. When I came back home that evening, the house didn't feel lonely. It felt like it exhaled. For the first time in years, there were no false echoes. No staged laughter in the halls. No eyes watching the vault. Just the creak of wood that knows who it belongs to. I walked through each room like a man reacquainting himself with an old friend. The kitchen, once the site of whispered betrayals over pie and candles, was just a kitchen again. The study, where I'd locked away the DNA report and the trust papers, now held nothing but blueprints and quiet. The nursery remained closed, not out of bitterness, but out of respect for what wasn't real. Samantha had vanished into the wind. No more blog posts, no public statements, no triumphant Instagram reels. She'd spent 3 years building a throne on air, and the day the gavel fell, the wind carried it away. I had no desire to chase her down with more lawsuits or vengeance. She'd already lost the only thing she truly wanted, access to something she hadn't built. Mason came by for dinner that Friday. We grilled steaks on the back porch, the same porch where he'd once whispered, "She lied to me." His shoulders were different now, not bowed by shame, but lifted, still healing, still human, but standing. "She doesn't own a piece of me anymore," he said, sipping his beer, watching the sky go red over the tree line. "That sip's the thing about weight," I told him. "You don't notice it when you sip's carrying it every day. You only feel it when it sip's gone." He smiled. Not the boyish grin I remembered from before Samantha, but something quieter, wiser. That's the kind of smile that doesn't need an audience. We talked about normal things. His job at the firm, a friend he'd reconnected with, a trip he wanted to take. Life finally unstuck from the orbit of someone else's lies. When he left that night, I stood at the gate and watched the tail lights disappear into the dark. I didn't change the gate code after he left. I didn't need to. Inside, the study lamp cast a warm circle of light on the drafting table. Mary Sepp's handwriting on the old trust draft had faded a little over the years, but the ink was still there. I traced the words with my finger. "For our grandchildren." She never wrote for anyone who claims the title. She wrote it for the people who'd earned it by blood, by love, by truth. Samantha thought she could bypass all of that with one lie wrapped in a white dress. She underestimated the man who loved the woman who wrote those words. The fireproof safe still held the DNA report, the trust agreement, and the final court order. I'd kept them not as weapons, but as record. Truth once revealed doesn't need to be sharpened anymore. It just sits there, immovable. I walked to the front door and turned the new key in the deadbolt. The sound it made, a clean, solid thunk, wasn't just a lock engaging. It was a line being drawn. Revenge had never been about destroying Samantha. It was about protecting what Mary and I built. A legacy poured into this land. These walls. This name. A legacy that almost slipped away under the weight of someone else's greed. She thought money made a family. She thought appearances could outvote blood. She thought a child she carried could bind herself to our fortune forever. But here sips the truth. You can fake love. You can forge papers. You can even charm a crowd. But blood doesn't set lie. And a legacy built right will not bow. Mason texted me later that night. I said I'm okay. Thank you for not letting her win. I stared at that line for a while. Not because I needed thanks, because it meant he understood now. The house didn't save him. I didn't save him. The truth did. I stepped outside and looked at the oak tree again. The same tree Mary and I planted in 1998. The same roots that saw everything: birth, love, betrayal, courtrooms, silence, and finally stillness. The night breeze was warm for April. A faint chorus of crickets filled the air. The house behind me wasn't a battlefield anymore. It was home. I whispered into the dark, not expecting an answer. You didn't lose me. You gave me away. That line wasn't for Samantha. It was for me. A reminder that revenge wasn't about hate. It was about refusing to let someone else define your ending. I turned back toward the house. Every brick, every beam, every quiet corner. It stood. And so did I. May 2023 arrived quietly. The kind of spring that doesn't announce itself with storms, but with soft rain that soaks the ground and makes everything green again. Asheville has a particular way of looking in May, like the world is holding its breath just before summer exhales. I stood at the front window that morning, coffee in hand, watching the light settle across the driveway. The gate light blinked its familiar rhythm. The same gate that had once been a line of defense, now simply marked a boundary: solid, calm, mine. The war was over. The house didn't remember the storm anymore. Only the foundation remained. Mason came by most weekends. He brought over fresh bread from the bakery down the street, sometimes with paint on his hands from helping a friend fix up a studio. He was rebuilding in small, quiet ways, not trying to fill the void Samantha left, because there was no void. There was only space now. We didn't talk about her. We didn't have to. Some ghosts leave loud, dragging echoes. Others just evaporate. Samantha was the second kind. Her blog domain expired. Her last social media post was dated March 6th, the day she thought she'd be crowned. Her name had faded from the public chatter like smoke slipping out of a window. But the oak tree in the backyard stood exactly where it always had. That tree didn't care about court orders, DNA results, or betrayals. It just grew like the legacy it watched over. One evening in mid-May, I sat under that oak again. The spring air was warm, and the grass had grown thick around the roots. I'd brought out Mary's old leather-bound journal, the one she used when we were still sketching plans for this house. I hadn't opened it in years. On the first page, she set written in her looping, architectural handwriting, "This house will stand if we build it with truth." Back then, I didn't fully understand what she meant. I thought she was talking about beams and rafters, about structures. But standing under that oak now, I knew exactly what she was trying to tell me. Legacies don't fall because of lies. They fall when no one stands up to defend them. Samantha had tried. She'd walked in wearing a smile, holding a baby, thinking love was a costume she could wear long enough to unlock a vault. But what she didn't understand was that the vault wasn't just money, it was Mary's name, our work, our story. She never stood a chance. I took a long breath and closed the journal. The sun slid low behind the trees, turning the edges of the yard gold. Mason arrived a few minutes later, his steps crunching on the gravel. He didn't need to ask why I was outside. He just sat down beside me. "That's different now," he said. "It should be," I answered. "We took our house back." He nodded, eyes on the oak. "I thought I set feel more broken than this." "You were," I said gently. "But then you started standing." He laughed softly, shaking his head. "She really thought she could rewrite everything." "They always do," I said, "until the truth shows up." We sat there as the last of the light faded, and for the first time neither of us felt the weight of what happened. The betrayal wasn't gone. It was absorbed into the structure, like the stress lines in old wood that make it stronger, not weaker. The amended trust sat in the fireproof safe, right where it belonged, $6.2 million protected. The family name untouched. Samantha's claim erased cleanly, legally, permanently. No appeals, no loopholes. No more late-night gate code changes. The house wasn't guarded anymore because it didn't need guarding. It stood on truth. I walked Mason to his car that night. The gravel crunched under our feet. He hugged me for the first time in months. Not stiff, not awkward, just steady. Then he got into his car, and I watched the taillights disappear down the road. I went back inside and did something I hadn't done since before all of this began. I turned on the old record player Mary and I bought in 1992. Jazz filled the house, soft, imperfect, warm. It didn't echo against walls held up by tension anymore. It settled. In the study, the safe sat quietly. Inside, the DNA report, the trust agreement, the court order, and Mary's journal. Proof, protection, history. But I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I didn't live in defense anymore. I lived in peace. I turned the key in the front door. The same clean thunk, a sound not of fear but of ownership, of legacy. I whispered the last words to the empty hallway. Not for her, not even for Mason, for me, for Mary. You can fake love, you can fake a smile, but you can sit fake blood, and you sure as hell can sit fake what we built. The house didn't answer, but it didn't have to. It had already spoken through every wall that stayed standing. Some people build legacies, others try to steal them. Only one kind lasts. And as the jazz played into the night, the oak stood watch. The house stood firm. And I, the man who stayed standing, finally let the storm rest.